You're just an ordinary cleaner. Stay in your place." The voice echoed loud as red wine splashed across a black woman's cleaning uniform as a room full of millionaires erupted in laughter. The woman wearing that uniform, a black woman in her 40s, stood perfectly still as the liquid dripped down her chest, staining the cheap polyester fabric that corporate America thought was good enough for the people who scrubbed their floors. The man holding the empty wine glass? Richard Morrison, white, mid-40s, CEO, $3,000 suit, and right then the smuggest smile you ever saw was plastered across his face. "Clean it up," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "That's what we pay you for, isn't it? Minimum wage to clean up messes." The executives around him, men and women in designer clothes clutching champagne flutes, some of them laughed nervously. Others pulled out their phones to record. Because humiliation in the smartphone age wasn't just entertainment, it was content. But here's where it got interesting. The woman, her name was Grace Wellington, but nobody in that room knew that yet. She didn't cry, didn't yell, didn't even flinch. Instead, she did something that made Richard Morrison's smile falter, just for a second. She pulled out her phone. Her hands were steady, deliberate. She wasn't shaking with anger or fear. She was calm, eerily calm. The kind of calm that came before a storm you didn't see coming. "You might want to rethink what you just did," she said quietly. Richard laughed. "What are you going to do? Sue me? You probably can't even afford a lawyer." Grace didn't respond to him. She was already dialing. The phone rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, and Grace spoke with the authority of someone who is used to being obeyed. The room went quiet. Not completely silent. There was still the murmur of confused whispers, the clinking of glasses, but that confident laughter from seconds ago? Gone. Richard was still trying to play it cool, but you could see it then. That tiny flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Security?" he scoffed. "Lady, you're about to be escorted out." Grace ended the call, slipped her phone back into her pocket, and then she looked directly at Richard Morrison with a smile that could have frozen hell over. "I'll wait," she said. "Now before I tell you what happened next, and trust me, what happened next is going to blow your mind, let me rewind this whole thing. Because the question you should be asking yourself right now isn't just, who is Grace Wellington? The question you should be asking is, how did a billionaire end up standing in a wine-soaked cleaning uniform, being humiliated by a man who had absolutely no idea he just made the biggest mistake of his life? If you want to find out how we got there, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is about to take you on a journey about power, justice, and what happens when someone mistakes quiet dignity for weakness. So let me take you back to where this all began. Back to the moment Grace Wellington decided to do something that most billionaires would never dream of doing. She decided to see the truth. If you believe nobody should be treated bad for the work they do and everyone should be respected, type respect in the comments and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Grace Wellington was 40 years old and she was worth $4.2 billion. But here's what made Grace different from every other billionaire you've ever heard about. She remembered exactly what it felt like to have nothing. She remembered the weight of exhaustion in her bones after a 12-hour factory shift. She remembered checking her bank account and seeing $17.32. She remembered the humiliation of being treated like she was invisible simply because she wore a uniform instead of a suit. Grace built Wellington Industries from absolutely nothing, over 20 years of blood, sweat, and strategic brilliance. She started as a factory worker at a small tech manufacturing plant in Ohio. While other workers spent their breaks smoking cigarettes and complaining about management, Grace spent hers reading investment books from the library and studying patent applications. She saved every penny she could, lived in a studio apartment with furniture from Goodwill, ate ramen noodles 4 nights a week, and when she had enough saved, she didn't buy a new car or a nice apartment. She invested, small at first, tech stocks that everyone else thought were too risky, startups that needed capital and couldn't get traditional loans. Some of those investments failed, most of them actually. But the ones that succeeded? They succeeded big. By 30, Grace had enough money to start her own company, Wellington Industries. Tech manufacturing with a twist. She treated her workers like human beings. Fair wages, real benefits, safe working conditions, profit sharing. And here's the crazy part. It worked. Turns out when you treat people with dignity and respect, they work harder, stay longer, and help build something great. 10 years later, Wellington Industries was a tech manufacturing empire with facilities across 12 states and contracts with some of the biggest companies in the world. But Grace never forgot where she came from. And she had a rule that most billionaires would think was insane. At least 4 times a year, she went undercover in her own companies. She dressed as a cleaner, a factory worker, a cafeteria employee, whatever would let her see the truth. Not the polished version executives showed her during official visits. The real truth. How supervisors treated their teams when they thought nobody important was watching. Whether safety protocols were actually being followed, if workers felt valued or exploited. And tonight, Grace was undercover at Meridian Corp. Meridian Corp was Grace's most recent acquisition. 3 months ago, Wellington Industries bought the struggling tech manufacturing company for $200 million. It was a good deal on paper, solid infrastructure, decent client base, room for growth. Grace decided to keep most of the existing management team, including the CEO, Richard Morrison. She wanted to give them a chance to prove themselves under new ownership. But here's the thing about acquisitions. Wellington Industries operated through silent partnerships and subsidiary holdings. Most employees at Meridian Corp had no idea who actually owned their company now. They just knew new ownership had taken over. The executives knew it was Wellington Industries, but they'd never met Grace Wellington in person. They had no idea what she looked like, which made tonight's annual executive gala the perfect opportunity for Grace to see what she'd really bought. The gala was being held in Meridian Corp's main event hall, all marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The invitation list included executives, major clients, and investors. The dress code was black tie. Grace arrived at 6:30 in a plain gray cleaning uniform and sensible shoes. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun, no jewelry, no makeup beyond basic concealer. She looked exactly like what she was pretending to be, a temp worker hired to help the cleaning and catering staff during the event. She checked in at the service entrance, where a harried catering coordinator barely glanced at her clipboard before waving Grace inside. "You're late. Find Susan Chen. She's the catering manager. She'll tell you what needs doing." Grace found Susan Chen in the kitchen, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the efficient movements of someone who'd spent decades in hospitality. Susan looked relieved when Grace introduced herself. "Oh, thank God, another pair of hands," Susan said. "It's been chaos all evening. Mr. Morrison changed the menu twice today, and the floral arrangements 3 times. We're short-staffed because half the usual crew called out sick." She paused, studying Grace's face. "You've done this kind of work before, right?" Grace smiled. "More than you'd believe." Susan handed her a serving tray and a cloth. "Start with the cocktail tables in the main hall. Keep them clean, glasses cleared, napkins stocked. Stay invisible, stay efficient, and whatever you do, stay out of Mr. Morrison's way. He's been in a mood all week." "What kind of mood?" Grace asked. Susan lowered her voice. "The kind where he snaps at everyone and nothing is ever good enough. Last year he made one of our servers cry because she brought him the wrong brand of sparkling water. Just be careful around him." Grace nodded and made her way into the main hall. The party was already in full swing. Men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns clustered in small groups, laughing too loudly at jokes that probably weren't that funny. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and hors-d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly in the corner, though nobody seemed to be listening. And there, in the center of the largest group, was Richard Morrison. Grace recognized him from his company photo, but seeing him in person was different. Richard was 45, tall, with the kind of polished good looks that came from expensive haircuts and personal trainers. He wore his tuxedo like armor and held his champagne glass like a scepter. Charismatic, confident, commanding attention without even trying. He was also, Grace noticed within 5 minutes of observation, completely full of himself. She watched as a young waiter approached Richard's circle with a tray of appetizers. The waiter offered the tray politely. Richard glanced at it, and his face twisted with exaggerated disgust. "What is this?" Richard's voice cut through the nearby conversations. The waiter stammered. The smoked salmon canapés, sir. From the menu you approved." "I specifically said Scottish salmon. This is clearly Norwegian. Do you people not understand the difference, or do you just not care?" Richard grabbed a canapé and held it up like evidence in a trial. "This is embarrassing. Get this garbage out of my sight and bring me what I actually ordered." The waiter's face flushed red. "Sir, I apologize, but this is what the kitchen. I don't want excuses. I want competence." "Is that really too much to ask?" Richard handed his champagne glass to the waiter without looking at him. "And get me a fresh drink. This one's gone flat." The waiter took the glass, which Grace could see was still perfectly bubbly, and hurried away, head down. The executives around Richard chuckled. One of them, a silver-haired man in his 60s, clapped Richard on the shoulder. "You run a tight ship, Morrison. That's why this company's going places." Richard smiled, soaking in the praise. "Standards matter, Gerald. If you let the little things slide, everything falls apart." Grace wiped down a nearby cocktail table, invisible in her uniform, and watched Richard hold court. He was good at it, she had to admit. Charismatic, the kind of leader who made people want his approval. But there was something underneath that charm, something cold. She'd seen men like Richard before, men who confused cruelty with leadership, who thought making people feel small made them seem big. Grace had kept Richard Morrison on as CEO because his numbers looked good on paper and his references had been solid. 3 months of ownership, and she hadn't visited in person yet, trusting that her management team was monitoring the transition. Looking at him now, Grace wondered if that had been a mistake. But she wasn't here to make assumptions. She was here to see the truth. So Grace picked up her cleaning cloth, adjusted her invisible armor, and got to work. And if you're wondering just how bad Richard Morrison's night is about to get, make sure you're subscribed because this story is just getting started. Grace moved through the gala like a ghost. That was the thing about wearing a cleaning uniform. People looked right through you. To the executives in their designer clothes, she wasn't a person with thoughts, feelings, or a life outside these walls. She was furniture. A function. Someone who existed only to make their environment comfortable. And that invisibility gave Grace the perfect vantage point to see everything. She positioned herself near Richard Morrison's inner circle, wiping down cocktail tablets that didn't really need wiping, straightening napkins that were already straight. Close enough to hear every word, but far enough away that nobody paid her any attention. What she heard made her blood run cold. Richard was in full form, gesturing expansively with his champagne glass as he spoke to a group of investors. "Gentlemen, let me tell you how we turned this company around in just 3 months. We cut the fat, simple as that." One of the investors, a woman in her 60s wearing diamonds that could probably fund a small hospital, leaned in with interest. "What kind of cost reductions are we talking about?" Richard smiled like he just won the lottery. "Worker benefits for starters. The previous ownership had this ridiculous policy of providing full health care coverage to factory workers. Full coverage for people operating machinery. Do you know how expensive that is?" He laughed, and several executives laughed with him. "We scaled it back to basic coverage. Saved the company $3 million annually." Grace's hand tightened on her cleaning cloth, but she kept her face neutral. Richard wasn't done. Then there were the safety inspections. Monthly safety inspections for every facility. Completely excessive. We moved those to quarterly. That freed up another $1 million in operational costs. A man in a navy suit frowned slightly. "Isn't that risky in manufacturing?" Richard waved him off. "That's what insurance is for. Look, you can either run a company based on fear of hypothetical problems, or you can run it based on actual profit margins. I choose profit." The group nodded appreciatively. The woman with the diamonds raised her glass. "To profit. To profit," Richard echoed. Grace moved to another table, her jaw so tight it hurt. Derek Pullman, the CFO, a nervous-looking man in his 50s with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, shifted uncomfortably at the edge of the group. "Richard, about those policy changes. The new ownership might want to review those decisions. Wellington Industries has a reputation for..." Richard cut him off with a laugh that had no warmth in it. Derek. Always worrying. They're silent investors, buddy. Do you know what silent means? It means they stay silent as long as the money keeps rolling in. And trust me, the money is rolling in. He clapped Derek on the shoulder hard enough to make the older man wince. They bought this company because they saw potential for profit. We're delivering that profit. They're not going to micromanage how we do it. Derek nodded, but he still looked uneasy. Grace filed that away. At least someone in Richard's inner circle had a conscience. Grace was reaching for an empty champagne flute on a nearby table when she heard a woman's voice, young and professional with a slight tremor of nervousness. "Mr. Morrison? I'm sorry to interrupt, but we need your signature on these acquisition documents. Legal says they need to be filed by tomorrow morning, and—" Richard didn't even turn around. "Can't you see I'm busy?" The woman tried again. "I understand, sir, but the deadline—" "Figure it out yourself," Richard snapped, finally turning to face her. "That's why we hired you, isn't it? To handle things? Or did I misunderstand what an assistant is supposed to do?" The woman was young, mid-20s maybe, and black, with her hair pulled back in a professional bun and a tailored pantsuit that looked modest but well-made. She held a folder of documents against her chest like a shield. Her name tag read Jennifer Hayes, Executive Assistant. Jennifer's eyes were shining, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course, Mr. Morrison. I'll handle it." "Good. That's what I want to hear. Initiative." Richard turned back to his investors without another glance. Jennifer walked away quickly, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Grace watched her disappear into the hallway, then made a decision. She followed. Grace found Jennifer in a quiet alcove near the restrooms, leaning against the wall with her eyes closed, taking slow, deliberate breaths. When she heard footsteps, her eyes snapped open and she quickly straightened, wiping at her face. "I'm fine," Jennifer said automatically, even though Grace hadn't asked. Grace set down her cleaning supplies. "No, you're not, and you don't have to pretend you are. Not with me." Jennifer looked at her, really looked at her, and something in Grace's steady gaze made her shoulders slump. "He does this every day. Every single day. Nothing I do is ever good enough. I graduated top of my class from Stanford. I have a degree in business management. I speak 3 languages, and he treats me like I'm incompetent." "How long have you worked here?" Grace asked gently. 8 months. I thought this would be my big break, you know? Executive assistant to a CEO. But he doesn't let me do anything meaningful. I make his coffee, I schedule his dry cleaning, and when I try to take initiative, like tonight with those documents, he humiliates me in front of everyone." Grace's voice was quiet but firm. "That's not about you, that's about him." Jennifer laughed bitterly. "Easy to say, harder to believe when you're living it every day." "I know," Grace said, and there was something in her tone that made Jennifer look up sharply. "I know exactly what that feels like." They stood there for a moment in shared understanding, 2 black women in very different uniforms, both navigating a world that constantly tried to make them feel small. "You're worth more than this," Grace said finally. "I hope you know that." Jennifer nodded slowly. "Thank you. I'm Grace, by the way, temp cleaner. Jennifer, and not so temporary punching bag." They exchanged sad smiles, and then Grace headed back to the gala while Jennifer composed herself. But what Grace had just witnessed, the callousness, the casual cruelty, it was gasoline on a fire that was already burning. Back in the main hall, Grace returned to her cleaning duties. She was wiping down a cocktail table near the bar when Richard Morrison walked past, gesturing animatedly while talking to a client. As he passed Grace's table, his arms swung wide and he bumped the table hard. An entire tray of drinks that had been set on the edge toppled over. Glass shattered. Liquor spread across the marble floor in a sticky, glittering puddle. Richard stopped and looked down at the mess. Then he looked at Grace. "Clean that up," he said, his voice flat and commanding. He didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge that he'd caused it, just stood there with his arms crossed, waiting. Grace knelt down and began picking up broken glass, carefully placing the shards on her tray. The liquor was everywhere. Vodka, gin, some kind of syrupy cocktail that was attracting fruit flies. Executives stepped around her like she was part of the furniture, continuing their conversations without missing a beat. One woman in a silver gown actually stepped on Grace's hand, Not hard, but enough to register, and kept walking without a glance back. Grace cleaned in silence. 10 minutes of scrubbing, her knees aching against the hard marble, her hands sticky with alcohol and dirty water. When she finally finished, she gathered her supplies and started to stand. Wait. Grace froze. Richard was still there watching her. He walked over to the spot where the drinks had spilled and crouched down, running his fingers across the floor. He examined his fingers with theatrical disgust, then looked up at Grace. This is still sticky. Did they not train you properly? He stood up, brushing off his pants. Do it again. Grace's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She knelt back down and began cleaning the same spot again. Richard stood over her, sipping his champagne, watching like she was entertainment. Maybe if you actually put effort into it the first time, he said loudly enough for nearby executives to hear, you wouldn't waste everyone's time. A few people chuckled. Some shook their heads but said nothing. Nobody told Richard he was being unreasonable. Nobody suggested that maybe, just maybe, he was being cruel for the sake of being cruel. Grace scrubbed in silence, her movements precise and controlled. When she finished the second time, she began to gather her supplies. Wait. Come here. Grace stood slowly and walked over to where Richard was standing. He pointed at the table. He ran his finger across the surface, held it up to the light, examined it like he was a detective investigating a crime scene. Then he shook his head with exaggerated disappointment. Still not right. He pointed at the floor. Again, and this time used some elbow grease. Grace's hands trembled just slightly just for a moment, but she knelt down for the third time. Her knees were starting to hurt now, sharp pains shooting up her legs. Her back was aching, but she kept her face completely neutral, a mask of professional calm. Richard sipped his champagne and made jokes to his colleagues. You know, it's so hard to find good help these days. People just don't have pride in their work anymore. The executives around him laughed. Some looked uncomfortable but said nothing. That was almost worse than the laughter, the silent complicity. Grace scrubbed the same spot for the third time, methodical and thorough. She could feel Richard's eyes on her, could feel him enjoying this. The power trip. The humiliation. Susan Chen, the catering manager, walked past and paused. She leaned down and whispered, I'm so sorry, he does this to everyone. I've seen him make people redo things 5-6 times just because he can. Grace nodded but didn't speak. When she finally finished the third cleaning, she stood up carefully, her knees protesting. Richard barely glanced at the spot. Fine, that'll do. He walked away without another word, without acknowledgement, without thanks. Grace watched him rejoin his circle of investors. And that's when she heard it. This company runs so much better now that I'm cutting the dead weight, Richard was saying. Starting with those overpaid factory workers. You know what their average salary was before I got here? $55,000 a year. For manual labor, I got that down to $38,000 with reduced benefits. That's called efficient management, gentlemen. The investors nodded approvingly. One of them asked, what about turnover? Richard shrugged. There's always someone willing to work. If they don't like the conditions, they can leave. There are 10 people lined up to take their place. Grace stood there, cleaning cloth in hand, and felt something harden inside her chest. Later in the evening, Grace was emptying trash bins near the back of the hall when she heard fingers snapping. Sharp, insistent, like someone calling a dog. She looked up. Richard was standing across the room, looking directly at her. You, come here, now. Every executive in the vicinity turned to watch. Grace walked over, her face neutral. Richard pointed at the carpet near his feet. Do you see that? How do you miss something so obvious? Pick it up. Grace looked down. There was a tiny piece of lint on the carpet, barely visible, the kind of thing that exists on every carpet in every building in America. She bent down and picked it up. And that, Richard pointed to another spot 3 feet away. Grace picked it up. And that one over there. For the next 15 minutes, Richard had Grace moving around his circle, like a trained animal, picking up nearly invisible specks of nothing while he narrated her supposed incompetence to the amused audience. This is exactly why I instituted performance reviews for cleaning staff, he announced. Some people just don't have standards. They need constant supervision. Grace picked up lint. Picked up a thread. picked up a tiny piece of paper that might have been confetti. Her face remained calm, professional, but if you looked closely at her eyes, you'd see something cold and calculating taking shape. When Richard finally tired of the game, he waved her away dismissively and returned to his conversation. Grace stood up slowly, her knees aching, her dignity bruised but not broken. And that's when it happened. One of the servers was making rounds with wine. Grace stepped forward to help, reaching for Richard's nearly empty glass to refill it. It was a routine gesture, something she'd done a dozen times that night. But Richard jerked his glass away at the exact wrong moment. Wine splashed, on his sleeve, on her uniform, on the floor. Richard's face went from surprise to rage in half a second. "Are you incompetent?" he roared. The entire room went quiet. "Look what you did to my suit. Do you have any idea how much this costs? $3,000, and you just ruined it." Grace opened her mouth to apologize, but Richard wasn't interested in apologies. He grabbed his glass, still half full of red wine, and looked Grace directly in the eyes. And then, deliberately, with cold calculation, he poured the entire contents over her head. The wine was cold. It ran down her face, into her eyes, soaking her hair, drenching her uniform. Red wine, dark as blood, expensive as sin. The room went absolutely silent. Some executives looked shocked, others pulled out their phones to record. A few were laughing, nervous, uncomfortable laughter, but laughter nonetheless. Richard stood there, empty glass in hand, looking satisfied. "Clean that up," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "It's what we pay you for. Minimum wage to clean up messes." He leaned closer, his voice low and venomous. "And when you're done, clean that table again. Fourth time's the charm, right?" Grace stood there, wine dripping from her hair, running down her face, soaking her uniform. She didn't cry, didn't yell, didn't even wipe her face. She just stood there, perfectly still, while the room watched and waited to see what she would do. Her face was unreadable, a mask of calm. But her eyes, if you looked closely at her eyes, you'd see something that should have terrified Richard Morrison. You'd see certainty. Cold, calculated certainty. If you want to see what happens when Richard Morrison finally realizes who he just humiliated, you better hit that subscribe button right now, because what's coming next is going to blow your mind. Grace stood there, wine dripping from her hair, running down her face in dark red rivulets. The room was silent, except for the nervous shuffling of feet and the occasional cough. Everyone was waiting to see what the humiliated cleaning woman would do next. What Grace did next changed everything. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Her hands were steady. Not a tremor. Not a shake. The kind of steady that came from absolute certainty about what was about to happen. "You might want to rethink what you just did," she said quietly. The words hung in the air like a warning that nobody understood yet. Richard Morrison laughed. Actually laughed. He turned to his audience of executives and investors, gesturing at Grace like she was the punchline to a joke. "Is she serious right now?" He turned back to Grace, his voice dripping with condescension. "What are you gonna do, sue me? Sweetheart, you probably can't even afford a lawyer." More nervous laughter from the crowd, but some people weren't laughing anymore. Some people were starting to sense that something was off. The way Grace was standing. The way she was looking at Richard. Like she knew something he didn't. Grace ignored Richard completely. She was already dialing, her wine-soaked fingers moving across the screen with practiced ease. The phone rang once, twice. Then someone answered. "Marcus, it's Grace," she said, her voice calm and authoritative. The voice of someone used to being obeyed. "I need you at Meridian Corp immediately. Bring the legal team and security." The laughter in the room died completely. Richard's smile faltered for just a second, but he recovered quickly. "Security?" he scoffed, trying to sound confident. "Lady, you're about to be escorted out. This is embarrassing. Someone call actual security and have this woman removed for causing a disturbance." Grace ended the call, slipped her phone back into her pocket. And then she looked directly at Richard Morrison with a smile that could have frozen fire. "I'll wait," she said simply. The tension in that room became something you could cut with a knife. Executives were whispering to each other now, confused, uncertain. Who was this woman? Why was she so calm? Why did she sound like she was the one in control? Derek Pullman, the CFO, moved closer to Richard and whispered urgently, Maybe we should just apologize and move on. This feels wrong. Something feels really wrong. Richard waved him off angrily. Are you kidding me right now, Derek? I'm not apologizing to the cleaning lady. She should be apologizing to me for ruining my $3,000 suit. Derek tried again. Richard, please, just... No. Richard's voice was sharp. Final. He turned back to Grace, his face reddening with anger and embarrassment. While we wait for your imaginary lawyer, why don't you clean up that wine you spilled, on your hands and knees, where you belong? Grace didn't move. She stood there, tall and dignified, despite the wine-soaked uniform clinging to her body, despite the red liquid still dripping from her hair onto the marble floor. She just stood there, waiting. Richard's face went from red to purple. I said, clean it up! His voice echoed through the silent room. Grace's expression didn't change. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't move. She just waited. And that's when Richard Morrison should have known he was in trouble. Because people who have nothing don't stand like that. People who are powerless don't have that kind of calm, that kind of certainty. But Richard was too proud and too stupid to see it. 15 minutes passed. 15 long, uncomfortable minutes, where Grace stood like a statue in the middle of the room, while Richard tried to continue entertaining his guests. He was talking, laughing, making jokes, but his confidence was cracking. You could see it in the way he kept glancing at Grace. The way his laugh was a little too loud. The way his hand shook just slightly when he raised his champagne glass. Grace's complete composure was unnerving him. She wasn't crying, wasn't begging, wasn't leaving. She was just standing there, dripping wine, waiting with the patience of someone who knew exactly how this story ended. Some of the executives started making excuses to leave. The energy in the room had shifted from celebration to anxiety. Something was coming. Everyone could feel it. And then, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, people saw them. A fleet of black SUVs pulling up to the front entrance. Not one, not two. 5 vehicles, sleek and expensive, moving with coordinated precision. The room went quiet again. All eyes turned to the entrance. The doors opened, and a man walked in. He was in his 60s, black, with silver hair and a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms making powerful people very nervous. Behind him came a team. Lawyers in sharp suits carrying briefcases, security personnel in dark clothing, professional and alert. They moved through the gala like a military operation. Richard Morrison, trying to regain control of the situation, stepped forward with his most charming smile. Gentlemen, there's been a misunderstanding with one of our cleaning staff. I apologize for any disturbance. If you could just... The silver-haired man cut him off mid-sentence. Where is Miss Wellington? Richard blinked, confused. Who? The man's eyes scanned the room and landed on Grace, still standing where Richard had left her, still covered in wine. His face transformed from professional concern to genuine alarm. Miss Wellington. He rushed over and his entire team followed. Are you all right? The room froze. You could have heard a pin drop. Every executive, every investor, every server and catering staff member stopped moving and stared. Miss Wellington? Richard's expression shifted from confusion to the first flicker of fear. I'm sorry, who? But Grace was already speaking, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I'm fine, Marcus, but we need to have a conversation with Mr. Morrison. Marcus, the distinguished attorney who'd just stormed in with a team of lawyers, nodded grimly and turned to face Richard. Richard looked between Grace and Marcus, his brain working overtime, trying to make the pieces fit. Wellington? As in, his face started to drain of color. As in, Wellington Industries? Grace reached up and wiped wine from her face with the back of her hand. When she spoke, her voice was cold. Ice cold. The very same. The room was so quiet, you could hear people's breathing. I'm Grace Wellington, she continued, taking a step toward Richard. And I own this company. Wellington Industries acquired Meridian Corp 3 months ago, which means I own this building, I own every asset, I own every contract. She paused, letting it sink in. And I own you. Richard's face went from red to white in seconds. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Around him, executives were backing away, distancing themselves, realizing with dawning horror that they'd just watched their CEO pour wine over the head of the woman who owned their company. Jennifer Hayes, Richard's assistant, stood near the back of the room with her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of vindication. Derek Pullman, the CFO, closed his eyes and whispered something that might have been a prayer. Marcus Washington stepped forward, his voice firm and professional. Ms. Wellington has been conducting an observation of management practices at this facility. What I've just witnessed, what this entire room has witnessed, constitutes harassment, assault, and a hostile work environment. He pulled out a tablet. And thanks to several cell phone recordings from your guests, Mr. Morrison, we have extensive documentation. Richard tried to speak. His mouth was moving, but his brain seemed to have short-circuited. I didn't. This is. Grace raised her hand and Richard fell silent. The power dynamic in that room had shifted so completely, so absolutely that everyone felt it. The cleaning woman covered in wine now commanded more authority than the CEO in his $3,000 suit. For 3 months, Grace said, her voice steady and clear, I've been reviewing this company's operations, financial records, worker satisfaction surveys, safety reports. She looked directly at Richard. Or should I say, the lack of safety reports since you eliminated monthly inspections to save money. Richard's face was gray now. Miss Wellington, I can explain. You cut worker health care benefits to boost executive bonuses. You eliminated safety protocols that have prevented injuries for 15 years. You've created a hostile work environment where talented people like Jennifer Hayes are humiliated daily for trying to do their jobs. Grace's voice got quieter, which somehow made it more terrifying. And tonight, in front of dozens of witnesses, you deliberately poured wine over an employee's head because you could. Because you thought she was powerless. Because you thought nobody would stop you. The room was so silent it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Grace smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You were wrong. Richard's legs seemed to give out slightly. He reached for a nearby table to steady himself. Ms. Wellington, please, I had no idea who you were. If I had known. If you had known, you would have treated me differently, Grace finished for him. That's exactly the problem, Mr. Morrison. You should treat every person with dignity and respect, whether they're a billionaire or a custodian. That's not just morality. That's leadership. She turned to Marcus. We'll need a full review of Mr. Morrison's employment contract, focusing particularly on the morality clause. We'll also need statements from staff members regarding workplace conditions. Start with Jennifer Hayes. She's been documenting everything. Marcus nodded, already making notes on his tablet. His legal team was fanning out, speaking quietly with staff members who looked relieved to finally have someone listening. Richard tried one more time, his voice desperate now. You can't do this. I have a contract. I'll sue. You'll do nothing, Marcus said calmly. Your contract includes a very clear morality clause regarding treatment of employees and representation of company values. You violated that clause tonight in spectacular fashion. Your termination is effective immediately, without severance. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Richard Morrison, who 15 minutes ago had been the most powerful person in the room, stood there covered in metaphorical ashes, watching his entire career burn to the ground. Grace looked around the room at the assembled executives. Some looked horrified, some looked ashamed, a few looked secretly pleased to see Richard get what was coming to him. This company is going to change, Grace said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. Starting tonight. The room exploded into chaos. Executives were pulling out their phones, frantically texting, making calls. Others were whispering urgently to each other, faces pale with shock. A few were already edging toward the exits, reading the writing on the wall and wanting no part of what was about to happen. Because everyone in that room suddenly understood the same terrifying truth. They'd been working for Grace Wellington for 3 months. 3 months of decisions, 3 months of policies, 3 months of behavior. All of it now under the microscope of a woman who literally owned everything they'd built their careers on. Richard Morrison stood there, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume he had no right to wear. He was sweating now, actual beads of perspiration forming on his forehead. His hands were shaking. He tried to recover, putting on that charming smile he'd used to climb every ladder in his career. Miss Wellington, I had no idea. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. If I had known who you were. Grace held up one hand, and Richard's words died in his throat. The gesture was simple, but the authority behind it was absolute. Save it, Grace said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. I've spent tonight watching how you run my company, and what I've seen disgusts me. She took a step forward, and Richard instinctively took a step back. You made me clean up drinks that you deliberately spilled, Grace said, her voice measured and cold. Not once. Not twice. 3 times. You stood over me, watching, making jokes while I scrubbed the same spot over and over because you enjoyed the power trip. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but Grace wasn't done. You had me crawling around on my hands and knees, picking up invisible specks of lint while you narrated my supposed incompetence to your amused colleagues. You treated me like I was less than human, like I was furniture that could clean itself. The executives in the room were frozen, some with shame written across their faces because they'd watched it happen. They'd laughed. Some had even recorded it. And then, Grace's voice dropped even lower. When you thought I'd made you look bad, you deliberately poured wine over my head, in front of everyone, to put me in my place. Richard was backing away now, but there was nowhere to go. He was surrounded by his former colleagues, all of whom were now distancing themselves from him like he was radioactive. You didn't just disrespect me, Grace continued. You revealed exactly how you view every worker in this company who you consider beneath you. Every janitor, every cafeteria worker, every factory employee, every person who makes less money than you do. You see them as things to be used and humiliated. Marcus Washington stepped forward and handed Grace a tablet. She glanced at it, then looked back at Richard with something that might have been satisfaction. Let's talk about your cost-cutting measures, Grace said, turning the tablet so Richard could see the screen. The ones you were bragging about to investors tonight. Richard's face went even paler. You cut worker healthcare benefits, saving the company $3 million annually. You eliminated monthly safety inspections, saving another $1 million. Grace's finger swiped across the screen. But that money didn't go back into the company, did it, Mr. Morrison? It didn't go into equipment upgrades or facility improvements or research and development. She turned the tablet around so the entire room could see. It went directly into executive bonuses. Your bonus alone was $1.2 million this year. Derek Pullman got $800,000. Your entire leadership team split $4 million that was supposed to be used for worker welfare and safety. The room erupted in whispers. Some executives were shaking their heads. Others were staring at Richard with dawning realization that they'd followed a man who was willing to sacrifice worker safety for his own bank account. Grace handed the tablet back to Marcus. This is the 3rd company I've gone undercover in this year, she said, her voice carrying across the room. I did the same thing at our Atlanta facility in March. I worked as a factory line worker at our Denver plant in July. And tonight, here at Meridian Corp. She paused, letting that sink in. Meridian Corp is by far the worst. The culture here is toxic, the leadership is corrupt, and it starts at the top. Richard tried to deflect, his voice desperate now. This wasn't just me. Derek approved those budgets. The board signed off. Jennifer processed the paperwork. He was pointing at people now, wild-eyed. You can't put this all on me. Derek Pullman, the nervous CFO who'd been quiet most of the night, stepped forward. His face was red with anger. That's a lie. You threatened to fire anyone who questioned your decisions. You told me personally that if I didn't approve those budget allocations, I'd be replaced by someone who would. Grace turned to Derek with interest. Is that true? Derek nodded, his voice steady now that the truth was finally coming out. Richard runs this company through intimidation. He's fired 3 people in the last 6 months for questioning his methods. Everyone here is terrified of him. And then Jennifer Hayes stepped forward. She was still in her professional pantsuit, but she'd been crying. You could see the streaks on her face. But her voice was strong when she spoke. I have documentation, Jennifer said, pulling out her phone. Emails, text messages, records of every time Richard violated company policy or mistreated staff. She looked at Grace. I've been collecting evidence for months, hoping someone would eventually listen. Grace nodded to Marcus, who moved to Jennifer's side. Send everything to me. We'll need it for the formal review. Jennifer's hands were shaking as she forwarded files, but she looked relieved, like she'd been carrying a weight for so long and could finally set it down. He made me rewrite reports up to 7 times, Jennifer said, her voice getting stronger. Not because anything was wrong with them, just to assert dominance, just to remind me that he could. He'd reject a report, I'd revise it, and then he'd tell me to go back to the first version. It was a game to him. Other voices started joining in. People who'd been silent, who'd been afraid, suddenly found their courage. A man in a janitorial uniform stepped forward from the edge of the room. Mr. Morrison made me remop the same hallway 5 times during a client visit. Stet said he was teaching me thoroughness, but the hallway was already clean. He just wanted to show the clients how much control he had. A woman in a cafeteria uniform spoke up next. He sends food back constantly, even when there's nothing wrong with it. Sometimes he'll eat half a sandwich, then call the kitchen and say it was made incorrectly just to watch us scramble to remake it. More voices, more stories. A dam had broken, and years of suppressed frustration and humiliation were flooding out. Richard was spinning now, looking for support, finding none. His face had gone from pale to red, and he was transitioning from desperate to angry. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I have a contract. I have rights. I'll sue you for everything you're worth." He laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "Do you know who I am? Do you know what I'm connected to? I'll bury you in legal fees. I'll destroy your reputation. Marcus Washington's calm voice cut through Richard's rant like a scalpel. "Mr. Morrison, your contract includes a comprehensive morality clause. Section 7, subsection 3, specifically states that any behavior constituting harassment, discrimination, or conduct unbecoming of an executive officer is grounds for immediate termination without severance." Marcus pulled up a document on his tablet and began reading. The clause specifically mentions treatment of subordinate employees and representation of company values in public and private settings. He looked up at Richard. "You violated that clause multiple times tonight alone, and thanks to cell phone footage from approximately 15 different guests, we have extensive documentation." Richard's anger faltered. You can't use that. Those were private." "They were recorded at a company event on company property," Marcus said smoothly. "They're admissible. Additionally, security footage from the venue has been preserved and is currently being reviewed. Every instance of harassment, every degrading comment, every moment of tonight is documented." Grace stepped forward again. "I built my company on 3 principles: respect, integrity, and fair treatment of every employee from the factory floor to the executive suite. You violated all 3. Her voice was like iron. "You're terminated, Mr. Morrison, effective immediately. No severance, no recommendation, no golden parachute." Richard tried one last desperate argument. "I was maintaining standards, the table cleaning, the lint. That was quality control. I was teaching proper work ethic." Grace's expression could have frozen the sun. "You weren't maintaining standards. You were exercising cruelty because you could. There's a difference between leadership and tyranny, Mr. Morrison, and you're about to learn it." She nodded to the security personnel who'd come in with Marcus. "Please escort Mr. Morrison from the building. He has 30 minutes to collect personal items from his office under supervision. All company property, including phones, laptops, and access cards, are to be surrendered immediately." Security moved forward, professional and efficient. They flanked Richard on either side. Richard's composure completely shattered. "You'll regret this. All of you." He was shouting now as they walked him toward the exit. "I made this company profitable. I'm the reason any of you have jobs. You're nothing without me." His voice echoed through the hall as security escorted him out. "This is discrimination. This is—" The doors closed behind him, cutting off his protests. The room was silent again. But this silence was different from before. This was the silence of shock, of relief, of people processing what they just witnessed. Grace turned to face the remaining executives. Her voice was firm but not cruel. "You all have a choice. Recommit to this company's real values, respect for workers, ethical business practices, and genuine leadership, or find employment elsewhere. I won't force anyone to stay, but if you stay, things are going to change. dramatically. Most of the executives were nodding, some with relief, others with determination. A few, the ones who'd laughed loudest at Richard's jokes, who had participated most eagerly in the cruelty, quietly slipped toward the exits. Grace watched them go without comment. Sometimes people told you who they were through their choices. Then Grace did something that shocked everyone all over again. She turned to Jennifer Hayes. "Jennifer, can you come here, please?" Jennifer walked forward, uncertain, still holding her phone with all the documentation she'd been secretly collecting. Grace smiled at her, the first genuine smile she'd given all night. "You graduated top of your class from Stanford. You speak 3 languages. You've been documenting misconduct for months, waiting for someone to listen. You have integrity, intelligence, and more courage than most of the executives in this room." Jennifer's eyes widened. She knew what was coming, but she couldn't quite believe it. "Effective immediately, you're the interim CEO of Meridian Corp." The room erupted in gasps. Executives were staring, some in shock, some in admiration, a few in barely concealed resentment. Jennifer's hand went to her mouth. "Miss Wellington, I'm only 26. You've never been given a real chance," Grace finished. "You've been undermined, dismissed, and humiliated, but you kept showing up. You kept doing the right thing even when it was hard. That's the kind of person I want leading this company." Grace turned to address the room. "Jennifer will have full support from Wellington Industries Corporate. We'll bring in experienced advisors. We'll provide training and resources. But the leadership, that's hers. Because she has what Mr. Morrison never had. She understands that power is a responsibility, not a weapon." Jennifer was crying now, but these were tears of joy and vindication and overwhelming relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." Grace squeezed her shoulder. "Make me proud." Then Grace turned back to the assembled crowd. "This gala is over. Everyone go home. Tomorrow morning we begin rebuilding this company the right way, with dignity, with respect, with integrity." People began to file out quietly, reverently, like they just witnessed something historic. Because they had. And if you're invested in this story and want to see what happens next, how Grace transforms this company and what becomes of everyone involved, hit that subscribe button right now. Because the final chapter is going to show you what real leadership looks like. 3 months passed, 3 months of transformation, 3 months of rebuilding. 3 months of proving that doing the right thing wasn't just morally correct, it was good business. Grace Wellington walked through Meridian Corp's factory floor in a tailored business suit, her heels clicking against the concrete. But this time, she wasn't invisible. Workers looked up from their stations and waved. Some called out greetings. A few stopped to shake her hand and thank her for the changes she'd made. The atmosphere was completely different. You could feel it in the air. People smiled. They talked to each other. They weren't afraid. Worker benefits had been restored and expanded beyond even what they'd been before Richard's cuts. Full healthcare coverage, dental and vision, mental health support, profit-sharing programs that actually meant something. Safety inspections weren't just monthly now, they were weekly, with worker input directly incorporated into protocols. Meridian Corp now had the best safety record in the industry. And the profits? They were up. Way up. Turns out, when workers feel valued and safe, they're more productive. They stay longer. They care about the quality of their work. They become invested in the company's success because the company is invested in theirs. Grace took the elevator to the executive floor and walked into the CEO's office. Jennifer Hayes sat behind the desk, reviewing reports on multiple monitors, her hair pulled back in the same professional bun she'd worn that night 3 months ago. But everything else about her was different. She carried herself with confidence now, authority, the kind that came from knowing she'd earned her position. "Grace?" Jennifer stood up, smiling. "Right on time. Wait until you see these quarterly results." Grace sat down across from her, and Jennifer turned one of the monitors so they could both see. The numbers were impressive. Profit margins up 18%, employee satisfaction scores at an all-time high, client retention at 97%. New contracts flooding in because word had spread about Meridian Corp's transformation. "You've exceeded every expectation," Grace said, genuine pride in her voice. Jennifer shook her head. "We did this. You gave me the tools and the support. But more than that, you showed me what leadership actually looks like. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I tell you something I don't share often?" Jennifer nodded. "I've been where you were," Grace said. "I've been the person dismissed because of my age, my race, my gender. I've been made to clean the same floor until my knees bled. I've been called every name you can imagine. I know exactly what it feels like to be treated as less than human." Jennifer's eyes glistened. "I swore to myself that if I ever had power, I'd use it differently." Grace continued. "I'd create spaces where people like us, people who've been overlooked and underestimated, could thrive, not despite who we are, but because of who we are." Jennifer reached across the desk and squeezed Grace's hand. "Thank you for the opportunity, for believing in me, for showing me that quiet strength can be more powerful than loud arrogance." Grace smiled. "You did the hard part. You showed up every day and proved them all wrong." Before leaving Meridian Corp., Grace made one more stop. She found Susan Chen, the catering manager who'd been kind to her that night, in the employee break room. "Susan, do you have a minute?" Susan looked up, surprised. "Miss Wellington? Of course. Is everything all right?" Grace sat down across from her. "Everything's perfect. I wanted to thank you for your kindness that night, and I wanted to offer you a position as Director of Corporate Hospitality for all Wellington Industries facilities." Susan's eyes went wide. "What? You managed chaos with grace, treated everyone with respect, and showed compassion when it mattered," Grace said. "That's exactly the kind of leadership I need." Susan's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes." Susan laughed through her tears. "Yes, absolutely yes." Meanwhile, across town, Richard Morrison sat in a cubicle at a mid-level management position at a competing firm. His office was small. His responsibilities were limited. His ego was in tatters. His new boss was a man named Marcus Thompson, a former janitor who'd worked his way up over 15 years through competence, integrity, and genuine leadership. Marcus didn't tolerate bullying, didn't accept excuses, and he had zero patience for executives who thought their position made them better than other people. Richard was learning, slowly and painfully, what accountability actually meant, what it felt like to be on the receiving end of scrutiny, what it cost to rebuild a reputation after you'd destroyed it. It was the humility lesson he'd needed his entire career. Back at Wellington Industries headquarters, Grace stood in her office overlooking the city. She was reflecting on the journey. 20 years of building something that mattered, that treated people with dignity, that proved profit and principle didn't have to be enemies. "You can't lead people you don't understand," she said quietly to herself. "Power should never distance you from humanity." 2 weeks later, Grace stood outside another Wellington Industries facility. This one was in Texas, a massive warehouse distribution center. She was wearing a different uniform this time, warehouse worker, complete with steel-toed boots and a safety vest. She smiled as she adjusted her name tag. It read, "Grace Miller." "Let's see what we learned today," she said. And she walked through those doors ready to see the truth again. Because that was Grace Wellington's real power. Not the billions in her bank account, not the companies she owned, not the influence she wielded. Her real power was that she never forgot where she came from. And she never stopped fighting for the people who reminded her of who she used to be. Because at the end of the day, true power isn't about how high you climb, it's about who you lift up along the way. And Grace Wellington? She was just getting started. If this story moved you, if you believe that integrity matters more than status, that leadership means lifting people up instead of putting them down, then share this video and hit that subscribe button for more stories about justice, courage, and the power of staying true to who you are.